Rancher lived alone for years until the Bigfoot dragged a woman by the river to his ranch. Out here in the frozen west, a man named Thomas Avery lived alone his cabin, the only glow for miles. One winter dusk, he found footprints too large for any man, and they led him to a sight he'd never forget. From the icy river, a towering figure emerged Bigfoot, dragging a young woman, Evelyn Carter, back from death's edge. Thomas watched in shock as the beast laid her gently on his porch, then lingered in the mist. Rifle in hand, his finger tightened, but his heart chose another way. He lowered the gun, whispering, "Not every shadow harms." That night, as Bigfoot vanished into the woods, Thomas knew some legends do more than haunt. Some, they heal. Before we dive in, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Type your city in the comments so we can see just how far this story reaches. And when we get to the end, I dare you to rate it from 0 to 10 because this one might just break your heart. Now, enjoy the story. In the year 1887, the Wild West was still a land of wind, snow, and unanswered legends. In a valley buried under winter's white, where stone mountains wore veils of mist and a river thundered through the canyon, there stood a small wooden cabin. Its faint golden light flickered against the endless night. That was the home of Thomas Avery, a middle-aged rancher who had lived alone for many years. Thomas had once been a soldier returning from war with scars, not only on his skin, but carved deep within his soul. He had lost his family in a fire, and ever since that lonely cabin had become his fortress in the wilderness. Day after day he lived shut away from the world, tending only to his horses, his cattle, and the hard labor of the open fields. Each morning the sound of hooves striking snow echoed through the valley like the slow, tired rhythm of a heartbeat. Each evening he lit the fire while the sharp scent of burning pine lingered in the cabin's air. At night, Thomas sat alone by the hearth, holding his worn old rifle, the only keepsake left from his father. To him, it was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of honor, of a home long lost, and of memories that never seemed to fade. His eyes always seemed to follow the shadows of the West, the strangers who wandered, the wild beasts that prowled, and the haunting silhouettes of memory that refused to drift away. He spoke little, silent as stone, yet within him still smoldered a quiet flame, the yearning for connection, for trust, and for forgiveness. But here in this desolate land, loneliness clung to him like the night that draped itself over the mountains. Each gust of wind through the rocks carried the echoes of battlefield cries. Each crack of ice upon the river stirred the memory of a home destroyed. And sometimes in the dead of night, he would jolt awake, trembling hand clutching the rifle as though waiting for an unseen intruder. Thomas Avery. The man of the West had lived this way for years, closed away among howling winds and falling snow. He believed his life would be nothing more than endless days slipping past like the hollow rhythm of a wandering horse's hooves. But what he did not know was that a legend was drawing near. A shadow moving through the forest, known by many names, whispered only in tales, Bigfoot. And when that shadow stepped out from the mist, Thomas would face not only fear, but perhaps his final chance to heal. Part 1. Footprints in the Snow. That morning, the valley lay hidden beneath a heavy fog so thick the tree line seemed to dissolve into nothingness. Thomas Avery rode his old horse Jasper, the loyal companion who had carried him for 10 long years along the riverbank, searching for water for the cattle. The river was half frozen in winter's grip, the ice cracking and popping under the weight of the current pushing beneath it. The air was so cold that every breath Thomas drew turned into a puff of white mist, lingering briefly before fading away. Jasper was usually calm, but today he was restless. His ears stood stiff, his eyes darting nervously into the fog. Thomas patted his mane gently and whispered, "Easy, boy. It's only the wind." Yet unease stirred within him too. He had lived long enough in the West to know animals never tremble without reason. As they followed the river's edge, Thomas suddenly halted. Ahead of him, pressed deep into the snow, was a trail of footprints. Enormous footprints far larger than any creature he had ever known. Each one sank inches into the ground longer than his forearms, stretching in a line that curved along the river before vanishing into the mist. Thomas swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the soft snow. He knelt by the clearest print and laid his calloused hand inside it. The size was staggering. Not even a man twice his weight could have left a mark that deep. He hissed under his breath, "Too big for any man." The whisper was carried off by the wind while his heartbeat pounded like a war drum. Jasper jerked against the reins, whinnying loud, nearly knocking Thomas over. The horse pawed frantically at the frozen ground, steam rising from his sweat in the biting air. Thomas gripped the reins tight, soothing him as best he could, though his eyes never left those strange tracks. Then silence. An unnatural stillness spread over the valley. The wind ceased its howl. The crows, usually cackling overhead, were gone. Only the heavy breaths of man and horse remained, and the massive footprints leading into the forest. Thomas rose to his feet, his hand closing around the grip of his revolver. For years he had learned that every shadow in the west carried danger, bandits, hungry wolves, the gray bear. But this felt different, something beyond the ordinary. A sudden gust swept through, carrying the sharp resin of pine and another scent, stronger, wilder, musky and raw. Something not of the familiar woods. Thomas narrowed his eyes. This was no ordinary smell. His gaze traced the footprints. They weren't hurried. Each step was steady, deliberate, as if the creature feared nothing in this world. He turned to Jasper, who still trembled beneath him, and he knew he had two choices: return to the cabin, lock the door, and pretend he had never seen this, or follow and face whatever waited in the fog. The soldier within him demanded, "Know your enemy." But the lonely man within him whispered, "And if this is not an enemy, then what is it?" Thomas drew a deep breath. The icy air burned his lungs, sharpening his thoughts. His hand rested on the revolver, though he did not draw it. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the knowledge that he stood on the edge of something unknown. He muttered into the mist voice, rough and low, "Whatever you are, I'll find out." And with heavy steps he pulled Jasper forward, deeper along the trail of giant footprints, step by step into the land of legend. Part 3. The Moment Without a Gunshot. That night the moon hung in the sky like a cold silver coin. Its pale light flooded the valley, turning the snow into a blinding glow and casting the forest into a still sea of shadows. Thomas Avery's cabin stood alone in that frozen brilliance, the firelight inside flickering through the cracks of the door like the only warm heartbeat in the night. Evelyn Carter lay upon the small bed, her breath faint but steadier than before. Thomas sat beside her, one hand gripping her icy fingers, the other clutching his father's old gun. He felt each tremor in his own body, the chill sweat tracing down his neck. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not the tread of a bear, not the prowl of a wolf. Heavier, deeper, as if the very earth stirred with each step. The wooden porch creaked and a massive shadow loomed outside the door. Thomas leapt to his feet, raising the gun. His heart pounded so loud it drowned the wind. The cabin door cracked open. Moonlight spilled in, revealing the towering figure. Bigfoot. It stood silent only a few steps away. Its breath came heavy clouds of white in the freezing air. Black fur shimmered under the moon, and its dark red eyes glowed like embers within the mist. Thomas raised the gun, aiming straight at its chest. His finger trembled on the trigger. Images of his lost family, the screams of war, the lurking predators of the West all shouted inside his head. Fire end it before it ends you. But then another sound slipped through the storm inside him. A frail breath. Evelyn. Thomas glanced back. Her chest rose gently. Her small hand shifted as if searching for safety. That fragile motion pierced through him, a reminder that a life was being placed into his care, not torn away. He turned back toward Bigfoot, and in that strange moment their eyes met. Not the glare of a beast, not the blaze of hate, but something weighted deep, almost human. Bigfoot did not advance. Instead, it slowly bowed its head, a quiet gesture, one that carried the weight of respect. Thomas's throat tightened. His finger slipped from the trigger. His breath shook, but his gaze never wavered. "Not every shadow means harm," he whispered hoarsely. The words fell into the night, soft as snow, yet echoing like a vow. Bigfoot stepped back, then another step. The porch groaned beneath its weight. Its shadow faded, dissolving into the fog beyond the door. All that remained were the deep footprints leading back into the forest. Thomas stood frozen, lowering the gun, his hands trembling beyond his control. The room fell into a hushed stillness, broken only by the crackle of firewood. He looked down at Evelyn, her breathing steady, her lips slowly regaining color. He set the gun upon the table, then sat again by her side. His rough hand enclosed her fragile one. In his eyes, a different light flickered, not caution, not fear, but something close to hope. Outside, the wind howled through the canyons, carrying away the heavy sound that had vanished. But inside the cabin, for the first time in many years, Thomas felt an unfamiliar peace. He understood that tonight he had witnessed something beyond every legend. A darkness he once feared had become the very thing that brought life back to his lonely home. Part 4. Healing in the Cabin. Inside the old wooden cabin, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft golden glow that drove away the mountain night's biting cold. Pine smoke drifted through the cracks in the walls, its sharp, familiar scent curling in the air, giving the space a fragile sense of peace. Thomas Avery sat at the bedside, his gaze fixed on the woman beneath the heavy quilt. Evelyn Carter, her name stitched into a damp handkerchief he had found in her torn satchel, breathed softly now. The bluish hue had faded from her face, replaced by the faintest warmth of color. He dipped a cloth into warm water, wrung it carefully, and laid it across her brow. His calloused hand trembled as it brushed her fragile skin. It had been so long since Thomas had cared for anyone but his cattle. For years the cabin had echoed with only one set of footsteps, one voice. Now Evelyn's presence seemed to kindle a spark of life in the silence. The night stretched on. Thomas changed the cloth, stoked the fire, listening to the fragile rhythm of her breathing. In the stillness, old memories surged back: his wife lost in the fire, his young son gone too soon. Those losses had drowned him in loneliness for years. And now beside him, another breath, another life had been placed in his hands. Toward dawn, Evelyn stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, her eyes dazed with confusion. She tried to sit up, but Thomas laid a gentle hand upon her shoulder. "Easy. You're safe now." His voice was rough, slow, as though reassuring himself as much as her. Evelyn looked around, then back at him. Her cracked lips moved faintly. "Where am I? My cabin. You were half dead by the river. I found you." For a moment she was silent. Then she shook her head, her words broken, halting. "No, it wasn't you. I remember hands, huge hands, pulling me from the water." Thomas froze. He thought of the towering shadow of the eyes in the mist of the moment he had not pulled the trigger. A truth stirred within him, one he had not dared admit: Evelyn had been saved by Bigfoot. He said nothing, only sat still, his gaze drifting toward the window where the silver fog still pressed heavy against the glass. Evelyn closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I thought I was gone, but then it was gentle. Not a monster. Gentle." Her words cut deep, slicing through years of belief. For so long, Thomas had lived by the thought that every shadow in the West carried danger. But tonight a survivor lay before him, speaking of the opposite. He rose, walked to the cabin door, and opened it just a crack. The night air swept in, carrying the restless whispers of the forest. The giant footprints still marked the snow outside. They had not led to death or ruin, they had led Evelyn to safety. Thomas whispered almost to himself, "Maybe not every shadow means harm." When he turned back, Evelyn was watching him, her eyes weak but filled with gratitude. He poured her a cup of warm water. She raised it with trembling hands, then gave a small nod. That night, they spoke little. Evelyn was too weak, and Thomas was never a man of many words. But the silence was different now. The cabin carried new sounds: the crackle of firewood, the far-off wind, and the heartbeat of two souls no longer entirely alone. By morning, Thomas had dozed off in the wooden chair beside the bed. Evelyn slept deeply, her face calm, her breath steady. Pale sunlight slipped through the cracks of the door, falling across Thomas's rough hands, resting lightly on the edge of her quilt, as though afraid to lose something precious returned to him. And in his heart, a new understanding began to take root. Bigfoot was not only a legend of fear, it was the keeper of balance in these mountains, a force that could destroy but on this night had chosen to save. And Thomas knew that from this moment on, he would never see the shadows in the fog the same way again. Part 5. When the forest spoke. The day the snow began to melt, the river softened its roar. Water trickled through the last shards of ice, and patches of green began to show across the meadow. The morning light reflected in a silvery mist as though the valley had dressed itself in something new. Inside the cabin, Evelyn Carter was recovering. Warmth had returned to her cheeks, her eyes no longer distant. She had stayed long enough to grow familiar with the smell of pine smoke, the creak of the wooden floor, and the quiet of Thomas Avery. But silence now was no longer a prison. It was a rhythm they shared. Evelyn stepped outside with Thomas. She helped gather firewood, feed the livestock, draw buckets of water from the well. At first, Thomas hesitated. He had spent years doing everything alone, never trusting anyone to stay. But Evelyn, with her gentle smile and patient hands, slowly tore down the walls he had built around himself. One afternoon, as the sun spread pale strokes of orange across the damp meadow, Thomas paused while mending the fence. His eyes drifted toward the edge of the forest. There, within the silver haze, stood a towering figure. Bigfoot. Thomas felt his breath grow heavy. His hand brushed the gun at his side, then stopped. Evelyn, sensing his tension, lifted her gaze in the same direction. Bigfoot did not step forward. It only stood broad-shouldered, its distant eyes piercing as if reaching into bone. Yet this time Thomas did not feel fear. He felt something different. A long moment passed in silence. The forest wind stirred the mist, shifted, the faint sound of cowbells echoed across the valley. Evelyn's hand pressed lightly on Thomas's arm, her eyes wide not in terror, but in awe. Thomas gave a small nod, and strangely, the great figure seemed to nod back, a quiet gesture like a greeting between two who had come to understand one another. Then Bigfoot turned away, striding slowly into the forest. Its shadow faded, leaving only the drifting mist. Yet the weight of that moment remained etched in Thomas's mind. He no longer felt stalked, but instead as if a guardian of the woods had revealed itself. Not an enemy, but a part of balance. That night, Evelyn and Thomas sat on the porch. She gazed at the stars and whispered, "I'll never forget those hands. He saved me." Thomas tightened his grip on the wooden cup in his hands. Firelight from the cabin flickered across the lines of his weathered face. His reply was low, almost a confession. "He saved us both." To Evelyn, Bigfoot was a savior who returned her to life. To Thomas, it was proof that even in the deepest shadows there could be another path besides violence, a hand that gives back instead of taking away. As night spread across the valley, the forest's whispering wind no longer sounded like a threat. It was like a distant voice telling the story of mountains and mysteries beyond human grasp. Thomas sat there shoulder to shoulder with Evelyn, his burden easing after years of weight. He knew he was no longer completely alone. Evelyn brought the warmth of human presence, and Bigfoot, though never staying long, remained the silent shadow of the forest, a witness in the dark. That night, when Thomas met Evelyn's gaze, a faint smile crossed his lips, the first in many years. And in the hush of the wilderness, he felt as though the land itself was speaking. The West was not only a place of danger, it was also home to legends that could heal. Epilogue. Where legends belong. At dusk, the valley lay bathed in the fading glow of red and amber. The sky turned pale gold tinged with deep violet. The wind swept across the open fields, carrying the damp scent of fresh earth and the resin of distant pines. Thomas Avery's small wooden cabin glowed softly, caught between the firelight within and the last rays of the sun outside, a quiet beacon of peace in the wilderness. Thomas sat on the porch steps, his hand resting loosely on his knee, eyes drifting toward the forest. Beside him sat Evelyn Carter, her brown hair stirring gently in the breeze. No words were needed, each presence filled the silence of the other. Far off through the silver haze, a towering figure appeared once more. Bigfoot. It did not approach, nor did it hide. It simply stood there vast and unmoving, as much a part of the mountains as the trees themselves. And in that moment, Thomas felt no fear, only a still respect. Bigfoot turned, walking slowly back into the mist. Its broad frame faded, dissolving into the forest as if it had never been. Yet Thomas knew the legend remained. Not to hunt, but to guard the balance. Not to sow fear, but to remind humankind of limits and of mercy. Evelyn whispered softly, "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" Thomas did not answer right away. His fingers tightened around the worn ring on his hand, his gaze fixed where the shadow had vanished. At last, a rare, honest smile touched his lips. Some legends aren't meant to be seen every day, but they stay where they belong. And within him, a quiet truth stirred in the Wild West. Not every shadow brings danger. Some legends exist to save. He looked at Evelyn, the life returned. He looked toward the forest where Bigfoot kept its watch. And in that twilight, Thomas Avery knew he was no longer the lonely man of the frontier. This story does not end with gunfire nor with fear. It ends with a simple truth that between humankind and legend, there can be a bridge called compassion. And if you believe that legends can heal, leave a comment, subscribe, and join us for the next story.